Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. I've been here 24 years. Next year, we're having a big party. For much of that 24 years, in fact, for all of that 24 years, we have focused a lot on U.S.-China climate relations, heavy on energy and crazy things like power grids. More recently, we've been doing a lot more, and some of you have probably tuned into the meetings where we've looked at food and climate issues. But today, I don't know, it's kind of free-ranging today. Free-range speakers today. So, so the topic of the meeting that you've, like on the airplane, like this plane is flying to Denver. If you did not want it, so this meeting is flying to Unpacking China's Climate Action. And now, as everyone knows here, the US and China, we are the climate superpowers in the world in terms of CO2 emissions, energy use. China's #1. But don't worry, America, we're still #1 for per capita. So let's turn back the wheels of time. Think back in 2021 at the Glasgow Climate Agreement. It was kind of a no-go, nothing really happening until the 11th hour. US-China Glasgow Climate Declaration, very heavy on methane. There was even a line on there in agriculture, so I was super happy about that. And then crickets, because we had the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, there's balloons, and who knows what all. The US-China governments have not come together on climate action based on the declaration yet. This week, we can talk a little bit in the conversation about Kerry and Xi Jinping got together in California. Xi and Biden, they might hang out at APEC, we'll see. But so what we're gonna do today is that my two panelists, they're going to unpack some of China's progress and maybe slippage, a little comparison to US. We could say progress and slippage as well. We're going to start off with Lili Pike, who's a freelance writer who focuses heavily on climate change, human rights, and US-China relations. Been writing a lot recently on coal and EVs in China and the US. She's published on foreign policy, science, magazine, Vanity Fair, I didn't know about that article, and Climate News China Dialogue. We're gonna go check that one out. Fashion and climate change, maybe. So today, her initial comments, she's gonna draw on some recent reporting she's done on electric vehicles and the battery industries in China, about the rise of it. Some of you know this story, but also some of the trade-offs the US is making between competing with China and cutting our own emissions. And probably diving deeper in the Q&A, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact this has on deteriorating US-China climate action. All right, after I don't know if you're going to cheer us. Well, she might cheer us up, who knows. And then Kyle Obermann, who is like Lili, is a good Mandarin and English speaker. You're good. Your Chinese is good, man. He's an environmental photographer who's based in Chengdu, hopefully getting back to Chengdu soon, right? A lot of his photography specializes on telling the human story around conservation. So today, he's going to start off showing us a trailer of his US-China Journey to Net Zero documentary, and also have a conversation showing some of his stunning photos. I can brag for you, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Stunning photos, because you can't say that yourself. It'd be a little bit too much. So he's going to be talking to us about another area of climate action in China, about their expanded use of nature-based solutions through national parks and wildland protection. And so your PowerPoint is up, Lili. I think the floor is yours. And you guys in the audience, you can grab some tea. At home, you could grab tea too, of course, coffee if you have it. And get ready your questions. We have a widget underneath the streaming. And please, you can start submitting questions anytime. And Jennifer, my assistant next to me, will let me know what those questions are. Lili, it's all yours.
Thanks so much for the warm welcome, Jennifer. It's great to see everyone in person here today. I'm a journalist. So I'll be asking all of you questions too. Get ready for that. So I'm thrilled to be here with two people whose work I really admire. You know, Jennifer has been the leading light in this space, and it's been, I've just learned so much from her. So looking forward to this conversation. As Jennifer explained, I'm a freelance writer. I focus on China writ large, but my background is also in climate and energy. So I'm always trying to combine those two topics in my writing. And I've spent time in mostly Beijing over the years. I worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council and China Dialogue, which is a website that focuses on explaining climate and energy issues in China. I'm based here in DC now, but I still have a large focus on China, and I thought for today we have this big remit, which is to talk about climate trends across the board in China. But I thought a good place to start would be the electric vehicle industry. First of all, because I've written a lot about it recently, so I have a lot to draw from. But I also think it's, really illuminating space to kind of look at broader trends in terms of China's own domestic climate pathway, but also U.S.-China competition. So I'll start on the U.S.-China competition side, and then we can step out of that framework later on in the conversation, hopefully. So today I'm going to focus on one article that I reported pretty recently for Foreign Policy. So this article was sort of fun for me because I always love to have a local angle to my reporting, which is difficult when you write about China from Washington, D.C. But one day I was actually biking to work, and I saw a large ad for this car here, the Polestar, which is an electric vehicle, in downtown D.C. I was very surprised to see this because this car is not just any electric vehicle. It's actually has a kind of special story to it. And I'm curious if anybody here in the room knows Polestar, has heard of it? Hands if you've heard of Polestar before. Okay, we got one. Okay. So it's, it's not Tesla, it's not BYD. This is a relatively small brand. But what's interesting about it is it actually started as a race car company in Sweden. And then over the years, it was actually bought by Geely, which is a Chinese auto company, a giant auto company. And so now it's a Chinese-owned electric vehicle company, and all the cars are produced in China. And so I was surprised to see this huge ad in DC where policymakers are very concerned about Chinese cars entering the United States. And I was thinking, how did this car get to the United States? So that was the question that motivated this reporting for me. And basically what I found is that Polestar has entered the US, but it really is an exception to the broader trend. So on the whole, these huge Chinese car companies like BYD, which actually has surpassed Tesla to be the top EV company in terms of global sales, they aren't entering the US at all. And there are a couple reasons for that. First of all, there have just been a number of policies that have been put in place to make it very difficult for Chinese auto companies to enter the US. Under the Trump administration, there was a 25% tariff added to a 2% tariff. So you have 27% tariff for any Chinese car company trying to export into the US. So that's a really big barrier. And then for those of you following kind of the back and forth over the Inflation Reduction Act, there are a series of incentives within the Inflation Reduction Act that penalize Chinese companies and Chinese components in competition with US car companies. So in order to receive tax credits under IRA, the car company has to have manufactured the car in North America, and they have to largely use battery components that are made in North America with critical minerals that are sourced from North America or free trade agreement partners. So layer all those ingredients, together, and you get, a really difficult situation for Chinese car companies that are, really dominant elsewhere. But it's very, very tricky for them in terms of the calculus for entering the United States. So how did Polestar get in? So Polestar is sort of a unique situation in that it's actually it has a relationship with Volvo. Volvo now is also owned by Geely, and Volvo has a factory here in the United States. So Polestar is trying to get around this import tariff by building a factory here in the U.S., and they will be actually selling cars that are built in the U.S. starting next year. So that's one way they're working around all those barriers that have been put in place. But for now, they are just exporting to the U.S., and they're betting that they can establish a foothold here in the U.S. and build up a reputation and then compete with other EV makers. And I think one other thing that differentiates them from other Chinese companies like NIO, XPeng, and BYD is they have this Polestar name, which doesn't sound distinctly Chinese. It's a Swedish brand, and so they can kind of introduce themselves to the U.S. consumer without a lot of that baggage that some Chinese car companies have. In fact, if you go to the dealership that's now a couple blocks away from here in DC, if you look at the posters, there's no mention of China on any of the marketing material. As it probably wouldn't surprise you. It's all they do mention Geely as the owner, but they say that they're a Nordic brand because they're headquartered in Sweden. So I think this is a really interesting exception that helps to shed light on this broader trend where the U.S. is really trying to protect the domestic market to help U.S. EV makers and battery producers to get ahead or actually kind of come back from behind in competing with China. So a couple takeaways from the story to think about. I think when we're looking at U.S. policy towards China and thinking about different factors that the U.S. policymakers are weighing, I think when we look at the EV space, it seems like from the experts I spoke to for this story and other stories that on the economic front, this is more or less working. The Chinese car companies have not entered the U.S., and so that is giving some space to U.S. legacy automakers to start to slowly roll out electric vehicles, which has been very slow compared to China. So when you have your industrial policy hat on as a policymaker, so far the Inflation Reduction Act plus the tariffs are working to mostly keep these competitors out. However, the Biden administration also has a mandate on the climate side, and I think that's where this is really interesting, is that by keeping these Chinese cars out, you are excluding some very competitive, affordable electric vehicles from the market. And the experts I spoke to said they couldn't quantify what cost that has right now for decarbonization, but it certainly comes at a cost. So, if you're a consumer who wants to go and buy an EV, but you're not able or willing to pay the higher price that some of these cars are sold at, you might want to buy one of the kind of cheaper Chinese models, but it's not available to you right now. And by comparison, in Europe, there is much lower tariff, and so Chinese car companies are already competing in Norway and Sweden and increasingly other countries as well. And so, as we talk further today about U.S.-China competition, I think this is a really illuminating case of how the U.S. is trying to balance these different priorities, and there are trade-offs. This industrial policy, as one source put it, the Inflation Reduction Act is industrial policy first, climate policy second in a lot of ways. And in this critical decade, I think that's a really interesting choice and one we should all talk about and be aware of at the very least. So that's the story of Polestar. I just wanted to spend another second talking about what's happening on the Chinese side quickly. Because the U.S. has its own set of policies, and China, meanwhile, continues to really just leap ahead in terms of its own domestic growth in the electric vehicle space. So this is from up to 2022 from the International Energy Agency, showing just the huge growth in electric vehicle sales last year, and that's continued into this year. The latest numbers show that the sales share is now up to 25% for battery electric vehicles and as high as 37% for plug-ins, so that's hybrids and electric vehicles combined. And to put that in comparison, in the U.S., we're only at 7% for electric vehicles. So it's, China's really taking off in this space. And, when we think about going forward, both from the U.S. competition angle and also China's domestic emissions angle, this trend has a really, really big impact. So on the competition side, China continues to subsidize the industry. They've been phasing out the subsidies over time, but they are continuing to give tax credits to consumers for the next 2 years to help to continue this huge boom in EVs. And that's in part because of the economic slowdown in China. So they saw this as an engine of growth, and they're continuing to subsidize it to some extent. So that's a really critical part of this. And then I think there are also some really interesting things that the U.S. can learn from in terms of the infrastructure rollout. China has the largest public charging infrastructure network in the world, and that's especially important in China where fewer people have garages to charge from. And as we get into that next phase of using EVs more widely here in cities where we don't have chargers at home as well, we can look to China to learn about that that infrastructure rollout. So the final thing I'll say on the Chinese side is that this peak in EVs has happened a lot faster. Well, hopefully it's not a peak, but this rapid increase in EV sales has happened more quickly than expected. And there was a big report that came out last week showing that the huge surge in EVs will probably allow China's oil consumption to peak sooner than expected, which has huge repercussions for overall fossil fuel use and therefore emissions. So it's predicted, based on the International Energy Agency's forecast, that oil consumption will start to peak in the coming years, probably 2 to 3 years, and then start to decline. There's some who say it will come even sooner. So that's far sooner than we'd predicted originally. And I think as we talk further today about the broader energy trends and China's climate pledges and where it actually stands, looking at where each of these fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, and coal are heading in the coming years is super important. So this is just the oil side and the EV side, but I just wanted to start with that, and then we can talk further about the overall trends.
That's great. Did you have another slide?
Oh yeah, this will come back later, but this is the fossil fuel peaking. We can talk about this in the broader discussion. But yeah, that's showing one case where one projection where overall fossil fuel use will decline starting next year potentially. But that's kind of more coal related, so we can get back to that in the broader conversation.
Okay, all right, good. So we can take the PowerPoint down, and I can, we're going to hold our questions real quick, but if you're online, make sure you submit your questions now, because you have limited time. And can I ask the AV they're doing it already, to put up the video, because your time has come, oh showman.
Now the fun part.
Now the fun part.
我最爱的2个国家，不同的语言、文化和世界观，一个气候，无论经济、疫情、人心怎么样，我们还要同舟共济。
Well, that same source is bringing strong winds from the mid-Atlantic will continue to win. We're already seeing many storm reports out of the D.C. area. Some trees down. We have standing water on the roadways as we have all the rain rolling. And so all this with the tides is causing many headaches as we head into Halloween weekend.
两国有碳中和目标，
That's where all the methane. Yeah, that's just
两个
great.
目标最终的影响力同时是相互依存。
research and development around clean energy.
This is one of the first projects in the U.S. to use bifacial panels.
然后要多合作。对。
去研究怎么样更好地把这个信息告诉更多的人。
我在波士顿市环境部门工作。
然后明天我们就开始爬山，现在我们要准备露营。
They want to get 1 million acres into regenerative agriculture by 2030, so what does that mean?
China's been the top investor in clean energy technologies for 9 years. In the U.S., we excel at sometimes kind of bringing these systems together.
我们今天也要拜访美国国家公园管理局的之前的局长。
So nice to meet you.
Hey, ni hao, okay.
What they call the Justice 40 initiative to see if they can put 40% into disadvantaged
这
communities.
个人类共同的愿景，就是如果这个国家实现了碳中和，那个国家没有实现，它会给你造成拖后腿的影响。
这个年代可能是我们最后的机会，确保未来的温度不再上升。中美气候行动得相得益彰，可以实现积极的联合合作。跟我一起探险。
Okay, yeah. So that was the trailer to a film called U.S.-China Journey to Net Zero. And it came out all across different Chinese channels basically throughout last year. There were, I think, 25 episodes for almost a runtime of 3 hours. And it was a really interesting project. It was actually funded mostly by the United States mission to China, so the State Department in Beijing and Shanghai. But the audience was for China, so they asked me to create a film series talking about U.S.-China collaboration, also highlighting, of course, U.S. action, but for a Chinese audience. So your client and your audience are very, very different. But it was a really interesting project because I actually was working within Weibo, one of China's largest social media groups, and they were promoting the film. So it was a really interesting, the whole film itself was a really interesting example of Chinese-US collaboration, and then I'll talk about some other examples throughout the film. But so this is kind of the more wilder perspective of China's climate action in general. So the film, again, a lot of different sites, kind of went on a road trip via actually driving an EV, driving a Tesla from basically San Francisco, and then we actually took Amtrak from Chicago up into Boston. And there's some really, really interesting stories that came with it that dealt with China, where I discovered not just were a lot of both Chinese nationals in the United States working at groups that were doing climate action, especially corporate sustainability. We also had a lot of US nationals who spoke Mandarin working at, for example, Boston in charge of their environmental program, which is just really cool to see. But also a lot of interesting companies, especially in agriculture. That was one of the realms that I did not know much about going into it. This site was Grove. It's outside of Salt Lake City, which was featured in the documentary. And it's actually the world's largest indoor basically cattle feed growing facility. And they're actually working with China right now to see if they can bring their technology to China. And why this is so cool, so this is about 1.5 acres worth size of a building, but it grows feed equivalent to 500 acres of land on 5% of the water that would be needed. Of course, where does the energy come from? Right now, they want to do clean energy. Of course, that's why electrification of the grid and clean energy is so important. So if this can come from solar or wind, their goal is to really cut down the emissions in the agriculture and the beef industry, particularly. Right now, China imports over a third of its alfalfa. And so, of course, a lot of the emissions tied to beef and cattle is tied with the supply chain. And so their hope is to bring this technology to China to cut out a lot of that supply chain emissions. Also, some of their early research indicated that when you feed cattle, you can see in the kind of lower photo there, it's the whole root that they're also eating. And when you feed cattle this kind of whole root green whole wheat meal, it actually reduces the cattle's methane emission as well, which is interesting and exciting research. So that was a really cool example from the film, and it was really cool to hear that they were very welcomed by the Chinese government and were in talks with them. There were some other agricultural groups in the Midwest especially, which were doing a lot as well. And then Boston, I don't know if anyone's heard of Boston Steel, but they do a lot of clean green steel production, and they are also working closely with China. And that was also really fascinating. And then in the preview that was shown, there was very brief shot of solar panels, and it was the first bifurcated solar panel site in the United States that was actually fueling an Apple storage facility, a data center, and that was actually from a Chinese solar panel group. So just all across the United States, there are really interesting examples for how we're still working together. And this was, in 2021, and this is kind of during COVID still. And one of the most standout examples for me, though, as a photographer, was the national park system. Before COVID especially, the U.S. National Park Service has been working with China quite closely as China announced its goal to build its first national parks in 2015, and they created that, they finished that in 2021 with the first 5 national parks. And before COVID, we had high-level exchange with sending our national park directors to China. They sent leadership to the United States, and it was a really, really encouraging sign for the two countries. And so a lot of people, I think when they think about climate and national parks or climate and glaciers like this, they think of glaciers as a symptom of the problem. They think of nature as a symptom, but oftentimes we forget that it's also an incredibly important solution. And so today I'm going to talk more about nature as a solution in China and how their conservation practices are very, very intimately tied in to climate action as carbon sinks. So a very brief overview, and Jennifer, if I start going too wrong, run away, just hit me. So this is a very brief overview of China's conservation system. China as a very technocratic, autocratic, system, they love to plan their spaces. So all the country is divided into 3 different spaces. What we're going to focus on is the ecological space. Within that, they've protected already 31% of their land through a new policy called ecological red lines. This basically says that, it's basically a do not harm policy, where it says you cannot develop within these lines if the EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment, says it will harm the environment. These inside the lines are not managed. They're not necessarily patrolled by rangers as a national park would, but this is kind of the stopgap policy of China saying we need to preserve up to 35% of our land against development and harm. Within the ecological red lines, you have all of the nature reserve systems. There's about 2,700. They protect about 18% of China's land. And now you have the new national parks. 5 national parks. They plan to build 49, and they want to claim it'll be the world's largest national park system. And this is all going to be complete by, they hope, 2035. So this is kind of the evolution where they first circle and then protect. You know, a lot of policies, they put it on paper, but they don't have the means to actually enforce it. But it's evolving to this 2035 goal as national parks is really the heart, but kind of within this onion of nature reserves, ecological red lines, ecological space. We could go into a lot of history, but basically 1956, that was the first nature reserve. Fascinating story, as you know, 1956 was kind of the beginning of the Great Leap Forward. And actually in 1956, the nature reserve in Guangdong, a couple of years after that, people were going up to the nature reserve to try to bring wood down to burn it to melt their iron, right? And so it's this crazy thing where we don't hear about it, but then there was these forest rangers, early forest rangers, who were stopping these people, tried to burn down the nature reserve to smelt iron, all the way up until you have some big jumps, especially the Yangtze River floods, the Grain for Green, right at the turn of the millennium, which was a big turning point in a lot of it, and now it's kind of reached a more stable era where they're not necessarily adding land, they're just kind of rectifying the problems that came with first circle, and now we're talking about protect. Map of China's first 5 national parks. They had 10 pilot parks originally. The first 5, Sanjiangyuan is the largest, 3 times the size of Yellowstone, Giant Panda National Park, Hainan, Northeast Tiger and Leopard, and then the Wuyi Mountains, a very small park, but also very significant for biodiversity. I've spent a lot of time in these places, and it's been one of the greatest privileges. This is in Qinghai and Sanjiangyuan, and just one of the most beautiful places. I was camping there, and this is one of the most beautiful sunrises of my entire life. Qinghai is just, it's so beautiful and biodiverse. Sichuan, of course, this is about just a couple hours drive from Chengdu. This is one of the most rare poppy species on the earth. It's only about found in about 100-kilometer square patch of mountain land in Qinghai, the Menacopsis barbaceta. This is the Giant Panda National Park, which is a very interesting place. And as you can see in this photo, what I want you to look at is the downed trees. Everywhere you go in China, while there's now this kind of yi dao qie, this kind of like knife cutting, you cannot go here, right? So this is actually off limits to even normal Chinese citizens, but you can see the vestiges of the 1950s, of the 1960s, of the communal forest ownership when they were logging, actually. And then the logs left to rot, and now you have this second growth forest coming in. So it's a very interesting story of people and nature. Now, what does this all amount to as far as climate? This is the number I want you to focus on. So this is the amount of carbon as a carbon sink all of China's nature basically takes out of the atmosphere every single year. What does that mean in relative terms? This is actually about, on the lower end, if it's 240 million tons, it's about 2 times the amount of carbon emitted by China's entire aviation industry, taken every year by the land as a sink. So again, these natural areas have incredible value. And so looking at where these sinks are concentrated, this is a map of China. Basically, this is in total carbon mass stored in the land, both in biomass, living organisms, leaf litter, and soil carbon. That's the gray part. And it's in petagrams. Petagrams is a strange term. It actually stands, it's not Queen of Pentacles. I got it confused with pentagrams and pentacles. No, petagram is 1 billion tons, basically. So actually the highest basically carbon storage area of China as a sink is actually the southwest, particularly actually, which may be surprising, the Tibetan area. So a lot of the forest is concentrated actually in the south. So you can see the forests here are basically this is biomass carbon. A lot of the blue is the higher concentrated in Guangdong and Yunnan. But actually, when you look at the B graph, that is soil carbon. So again, we're talking about permafrost, tundra, in Qinghai especially, the Tibetan Plateau, there's a ton of carbon. This is one of the hot spots for all of China's stored carbon in the soil. But as we know, climate change, and in fact, the temperature, the climate in Qinghai on the Tibetan Plateau is changing, is warming about 2 to 3 times the global average today. So this is, again, in Qinghai, where you can kind of see these layers of both soil permafrost going up to, glacier, which counts as kind of permanent mountain permafrost, up in the levels throughout the ecosystem. But you have a lot of runoff, and actually a lot of methane comes from effusion in the rivers. Of course, you have the glacial melt, which then exposes a lot of the soil as well to thaw. And this is a Tibetan living in Qinghai doing one of the 8 annual glacier surveys in Tibet. And then, of course, when the permafrost melts, you have land that actually collapses. This was one morning I was staying with a local family, and we all drank water from one stream. We didn't filter it, we just drank it. But one morning we woke up and the stream was brown for the whole village. And we didn't really know what happened, so we rode our horses up, and we found at the kind of the source of the spring, the entire land had collapsed. And there are sites all across this, all over China, and the rate of collapse since the 1960s, late 1960s, has actually increased by 12 times. The area of collapse has increased by 40 times since then. So this is an incredibly fast-changing place. And of course, this is not just a symptom. When this collapses, it allows more soil to decompose, and you have more methane release through the soil, right? So it's not just a symptom, but it also could be a cause that could perhaps move this area from a carbon sink to actually a carbon emitting source in China. The permafrost is all over. Again, the blue areas are permafrost. What's interesting here is that you have natural gas hydrates, which have been discovered in this area, as well as the South China Sea. And in 2017, China just successfully started extracting natural gas from these places. And there's a question of, will they start developing these areas? But the national parks are hopefully going to stop that from happening, at least in Qinghai, the Tibetan Plateau. And the last thing I'll point on today is that the national parks are very, very closely tied with biodiversity. And again, biodiversity is one of these things that I think people separate in their minds. They say, oh, of course, climate will affect wildlife. But how does wildlife affect climate? This is a very, very important topic that is incredibly under-discussed. So China has really built its national parks around these high kernel biodiverse areas. And that's because it is the world's 4th most biodiverse country. This is an interesting comparison with the United States, but there are wildlife all across the country. So this is an interesting photo. This is kind of to see who's awake and who's still watching. So there's actually, I think, 7 or 10 animals in this photo. I've given many talks, and no one has ever found one of them. So again, if anyone can find one, I'll give you the biggest high five you've ever had. Anyone can try to walk up and point if you want. All right, well, let's see where they are. Okay, so there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's 11. Oh, there they are, all right, blue sheep. These are actually the favorite prey of snow leopards, and they're very well suited for their environment. You can't see them. But snow leopards are also very, very well suited, actually a very similar color. Biodiversity across China. Of course, pandas, we mostly see photos of them in the Washington Zoo or in bamboo, but they're a lot more diverse than we think. They actually feed off meat some of the time to get calcium in their diets. They go up into rocky, high places. And what's very interesting about this photo is that actually this snow leopard and this panda were taken in the exact same spot by an infrared camera in Wolong Nature Reserve. So snow leopards and pandas share the same habitat in Sichuan. This is the only place in the world where this happens, and it's incredibly interesting. So this is a very interesting study on trophic rewilding, but basically it's a study on how wildlife affects carbon sequestration by the land. And more people are looking at how wildlife as seed dispersers is actually, for example, yaks in cold areas actually trample and compact the earth, which helps preserve permafrost. And there's more and more research looking at actually how wildlife helps maintain land as a carbon sink. And so while research hasn't been done in China, this is a very interesting topic direction, especially in Qinghai, in Sanjiang, where the national park is, where a lot of times herders and yaks get blamed for grassland degradation, but we don't know the overall kind of balance and effect, where a lot of these areas were traditionally roamed by wild yaks, and if we take the yaks out, what happens to the grasslands versus the compaction of permafrost, etc. So these are very dynamic and interrelated subjects and causes when we talk about climate change. Of course, there are threats, and these are what the nature reserves are really trying to keep out. This is a poacher caught on infrared camera in, I think, 2019 or 2018. You can see he has this old gun. Basically, they make their own gunpowder and bullets. He's wearing an animal skin. But what's actually most frightening is in his hand, there's this wire, and it's a wire trap. You can buy them for just cents on Taobao, and you can, if you're a poacher, you can put up 100 in a day, and they're one of the most deadly ways to catch wildlife. And so that's why most of my work has focused on the human side of conservation, the rangers in China who are out there every day. And these are the front lines, ensuring that these places are protected so they're more resilient, but also that they remain as pristine places that keep themselves going as carbon sinks from Tibet all the way to Sichuan, where for me we have the best food. They like to hike with basically a walk in the mountains. So this is some of the best eating I've ever had. And much credit for all my work goes to these people who brought me to these places and kind of showed me what the land and wildlife looks like. So I'll end there as a very brief introduction, and we can move on to Q&A.
All right, so let's applause for Kyle and Lili for their insights. So we went from electric vehicles to hidden rams. I like it. We literally cover. They were rams, right?
Blue sheep.
Blue sheep. Sorry. Okay. So all right. So before I open up to you guys, I wanted one question I kind of had was okay. Let's start with both. A question for both of you. Like you touched on some, but for like in China, for the electric vehicles. And let's also then talk about the coal. What are some of the biggest uncertainties? I mean, you said that it's on the way up. And you did have that great pun about the engine of decarbonization. And then same thing for you, be honest with us. What are some of the uncertainties for China actually, they've got this big goal in the national parks and actually that these will become super duper whooper carbon sinks. That's a technical term. I hope you followed it. So maybe start with, do you need that slide put up?
Yeah, if you could bring
Can you
that
put that
slide back
up
up, we can talk through
Lili's
that.
favorite slide that has things, it actually kind of looks a little bit like that mountain that you showed, one of the mountains there, Kyle.
With
Her
all the,
slide.
I'm sure there's a mountain. I'm sure there's.
And maybe there's some of those sheep hiding
Let's
there.
see.
Okay.
Look.
I can use the thing to get it over. Thank you. Let's see. Okay. So this is a great question, Jennifer, because there are a lot of uncertainties, and I think that's what makes it really tricky to talk about China's climate trends right now is, we had the pandemic and China's emissions actually went up as the rest of the world's decreased, and China's rise in emissions offset the rest of the world's decrease. So that was sort of a, a troubling trend where we could have seen emissions actually go down. However, after that spike in emissions, China's emissions have stabilized, and some experts actually say that China's emissions fell last year because the data isn't actually very clear. So we're working with a lot of kind of murky signs, and the data becomes clear over time, hopefully. But as of now, the best projections that I've seen do think that China will certainly peak its emissions by 2030, which is its nationally determined contribution goal under the Paris Agreement. But when that peak will come and how high it is a really big question. The IEA is very optimistic in kind of the spectrum of projections, and according to their energy outlook, which was just released, China's fossil fuel use will peak next year, which you see in this chart. The fossil fuels are in gray and the clean energy is in green. And so as you see, by 2025, the gray starts to go negative. And so that means that China will be building enough solar and wind that the increase in energy demand will be entirely fulfilled by the clean energy. So we won't need to see an increase in coal consumption any longer. So that decrease is entirely driven by the decrease in coal consumption. The IEA thinks that the oil peak will come next in the next couple years, and then natural gas will actually peak in the late 2030s, according to their projection. But this is just one projection. There are many different models, and a lot of experts think that the peak in fossil fuel use, namely coal and emissions, will come later, closer to 2030. That is mostly dependent on what happens to the economy. As you all probably know, China's economy has faced some headwinds recently. There was obviously the COVID lockdowns caused a decrease in manufacturing. And then this year we've seen the continuation of the real estate slump, which in some ways might be positive for climate change because China is now actually going forward, it will start to use less steel and cement to build new buildings. And so that may help with this IEA optimistic projection. But at the same time, there have been some other trends that have led other experts to be less optimistic. Those include the war in Ukraine, which have caused China to be the war has caused China to be more concerned about energy security, as well as some weather trends, drought last year and the year before, which reduced China's hydropower output. And so that has caused China to continue to build a lot of coal plants, actually more than the past 2 5-year periods, which is a very frightening trend from a climate perspective because once you have those coal plants, it's harder to make the case to not use them. And so the Chinese leaders have said that those coal plants will increasingly be used as backup power to support renewable energy. But as one expert told me in a recent article I wrote, there's going to be a showdown between this really powerful coal industry and the increasingly powerful renewable energy industry. And so that's another uncertainty, which group will be able to lobby the government to shape policy to favor their interests. So as far as I can see, there are a lot of uncertainties right now in terms of the shape of the emissions curve and maybe also the conversations with between the U.S. and China that are happening now might have some influence over that shape of that curve too.
That's cool. Kai?
Yeah, I think there are, when it comes to national parks and wildlands, kind of 3 major uncertainties I would point out. One is what to do about depopulating rural areas, both as far as forced relocation. There are 650,000 people originally living in the 10 pilot parks. How will the relocations affect the people living there that will and are happening is a very interesting topic for research. The people I've talked to in China, some are split about it. Some are quite frustrated being relocated, and some are actually happy to be into urban centers with opportunities for education and a different hukou, a housing permit. But also, as you know, a lot of the young people are leaving the rural area. Actually, well, some now are being pushed back because of China's economy. But a lot of the villages that China has used to kind of rely on as sources of rangers and scientists to protect and monitor the wildlife are aging out. The average age of a forest ranger is in the upper 40s to lower 50s. So as these people get older and there's no young people to replace them, where's the scientific data going to come from? Because basically all of the scientific data about China's wildlife that you see is being collected from local rangers in these reserves. And that will be a very interesting future topic and direction. Another interesting question will be, how do these national parks affect China's overall populace and their relationship with the wilderness, their wilderness ethos? Will there be access? Right now it actually looks like there won't be access. It's not going to look like the United States park system where you have backcountry permits and they want people to go off and have individual, liberalizing experiences alone in nature. It's going to be more towards science education, right? Like identify this bird and this is what the work looks like. But it's a very interesting question because the U.S. park system is absolutely overloaded with tourism. China has 4 times the population. How do you manage that? This is a very open-ended question. But they are closing down a lot of the mountains that mountaineers like to climb, and it's going to be very interesting. And the third is, I'm very optimistic that China will do an excellent job at making this line and saying you cannot cross it and this place has to be protected. And they have 30 satellites in the air that are scanning the land at a resolution of 1 to 2 meters at multiple times a year, and they can basically detect human interference in these areas with 90% accuracy right now. And it's this whole sky, sea, land, space system that they've set up. But how will then their infrastructure investments and their supply sourcing of timber and from other countries like Southeast Asia and Africa affect those carbon sinks, right? If China protects theirs very well, but then just sources their materials from other places not as sustainably, that's not really going to help as far as a net. So I think those are really three interesting questions, and I think it's very hard to answer right now, but I'm watching those very closely.
I have to think when you mentioned about the monitoring the construction. When I was in Hunan province in 1987, and we got taken out to, and I'm forgetting the name right now. It was a nature reserve in Hunan, and shortly after I was there, because it was just being constructed, they built an elevator and all kinds of restaurants, and so. The construction in nature reserves had this problem for a long time, and that's why the eco-red lines, I want the audience to understand, that's why the eco-red line policy was so important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In that time, there was really no guidelines on what was ecotourism, like what kind of footprint can it have. So it's moving in a more positive direction. But there's still, even in the national parks in Sanzhengyuan, there was a story that basically the local government was more actually, they didn't want to develop a lot of road systems, they wanted to keep it more natural, but the local government in Xining and Xinghai really wanted to bring in tourism and we have the biggest national park in China, let's build roads. And so there's even a conflict on the provincial level and the local levels as well that they don't really know how to reconcile yet.
Yeah. Okay, maybe, I mean, I have more questions, but Jennifer, there was one from online. So this is Jennifer Nguyen, my assistant.
Hi. So there was a question that was asking, is it true that China extensively plants trees of commercial value inside national parks? A case in point was the rubber plantations at Xishuangbanna National Reserve, where herds of elephants had to leave the reserve to find a suitable habitat outside their traditional range in 2020.
And to say who that was?
That was from Alok Gupta, a freelance environmental journalist.
Okay, thanks.
Ooh, I have a photo. This is lovely. It's almost. Oh wait, no, that's not my PowerPoint. I don't know what to do.
She'll get it up. But you can start answering.
Yeah. So I don't. From what I've seen, they're not. Is that a present tense? No, I haven't heard anything that they're continuing to plant rubber plantations inside of a reserve. Okay, we're gonna have to go real back. Queen of Pentacles is gonna come up again. But there is definitely, in Xishuangbanna, there's a massive amount of rubber plantations, and it is a massive problem. And I think these rubber plantations actually are being accounted into a lot of China's afforestation programs, and when it claims all these numbers, they're counting the rubber plantations. So here's what it looks like: a real forest versus rubber plantation. Guess which is which? So you have the rubber plantation there on the right, and it's obviously these rows of very manicured trees, and there's no understory. Right? It's just these very slim trees, zero understory, zero biodiversity. On the right, this is Xishuangbanna National Nature Reserve. So when I was there, I didn't see rubber plantations crossing that river. That is the border of that river. It is possible. I've been in nature reserves like the Gaoligong National Nature Reserve, where you've seen caoguo kind of planted in small swaths within these forests. But within the nature reserve itself, I haven't seen that. But rubber plantations are a massive problem. Definitely a lot of the elephant habitat has been affected by that. What was interesting was when those elephants were migrating, during that whole news cycle, the Yunnan government actually kind of put on a fast-track pipeline the creation of a national park in that area. That wasn't really in talks before the whole elephants started migrating. But again, this is
walking through the streets of Kunming.
And walking through the streets of Kunming. But it's a very hard problem because in some ways the elephants, their growing population is a good sign. But what do you do now that you've successfully protected Xishuangbanna National Nature Reserves? You have a growing population of elephants. They want to move to the streets of Kunming. They want to buy an apartment and have Yofang, Yochua, right? But how do you expand the reserve, right? If you kick people out, you're going to get criticized, and if you have elephants roaming around the street, you're going to get criticized. So it's a hard problem to solve.
Yeah, those elephants went viral, I recall. Yeah. Let's open up some questions here. So we'll go this gentleman, and then Karen. And if you just press it till it says green and your name quickly and a succinct question.
Hi, my name is Ujjwal Pluri from U.S. Customs, and the question that I have for you is, we talk a lot about separating, for example, the natural forests from the human environment, but what steps are being taken with regards to green cities, revitalizing and rejuvenating the existing biomes and ecological spaces in coastal China in the Yangtze region, where there was also in the past a lot of rich biodiversity? Are steps being taken to perhaps revitalize it rather than having to go 1,000 miles to a national park in Qinghai? residents of, say, Shanghai or Shenzhen can enjoy that same type of biodiversity at home.
Karen, you ask your question, then we'll do a 2-for-1.
Yeah, this is the slide that you all had up about the carbon storage in the soil. You showed the area of Qinghai being a hotspot, but I also noticed there's a lot of blue up in Heilongjiang. And Heilongjiang is a very agricultural area, so I wanted to ask more about that. Why is that area also a high area of carbon sequestration in the soil?
Okay, so we have one
and
question.
My name's Karen Mance. I'm a Wilson Center Fellow.
Okay, yeah, so here's the map that you were referring to. So the first question is really broad, but really interesting and a really good question. So as I mentioned, I think there's supposed to be about 49 national parks. Right now, the first ones, you only have Wuishan, which is more in the east. But a lot of the planned ones, there are smaller ones that are going to be dotted around. But again, you have most of the land that's easily incorporated is going to be in the west. Now, there are a lot of cities that are pushing to be sponge cities that are really, especially with the floods China's had pretty much every summer in the last couple of years. Sponge city infrastructure has been really popular. In Shanghai, there's been a really interesting case of trying to study and provide habitat for raccoon dogs that are in Shanghai. Beijing is an incredible birding city. It's right on the avian migration corridor from basically Russia kind of down to Hong Kong, and so there's been a lot of conflict back and forth about how to preserve wetlands in Beijing. Also in Shenzhen, there is a big, actually it relates to the Red Lines, where there's a nature reserve called the Hongtian Nature Reserve, where a bunch of mangroves are. And they wanted to build a shipping lane kind of right outside that nature reserve, outside of the boundaries of the nature reserve. But the local environmental groups kind of protested, saying that, well, if you build this and you dig out and you this kind of estuary zone, you're just going to affect the bird habitat. And look, it's in a red line. And so they actually got to win out, saying that and they got a new environmental impact assessment that showed the impact, and they basically canceled this kind of dredging project within these boundaries. But so you don't have the scale, but I think you're moving that way, and I think definitely to watch the next 5 years. Sponge cities are focused on, rewilding urban wildlife. And then, these smaller national parks that will pop up. And then so with the Heilongjiang question, a lot of that in the very northern tip is also permafrost. And then you also have kind of in the Jilin area, that's where you have the Northeast Tiger and Leopard National Parks. You have a lot of protected land up there. And then you actually do have a lot of protected forest area. I mean, a lot of China's protected and national forests are on the very tip of the Heilongjiang, on the tip of Russia. So there is a lot of cropland as well, and that's kind of in the map A. I think kind of in that center area outside of that blue. The most organic carbon, soil organic carbon, which is going to be in the forest. But the northern tip of Heilongjiang, really important area, and that's why we also have a national park up there.
I want to add to the first question about the cities. Well, China, they did pass their national wetland protection law, and that along with the Yangtze River protection law, where a bunch of fishers are saying you can't fish it anymore. But even before then, banning land reclamation on the coasts. And so that's a really good sign. I mean, there's like the International Crane Group. I'm forgetting their name. It's so embarrassing. But there's a lot of international groups, the Crane folks, the WWFs, who've been working with a lot of local activists and communities to rewild some of the wetlands. Sometimes even negotiating with farmers. I mean, we see that similar to like the elephant village conflicts. They're keeping wetlands for the birds and the other wildlife. The dams on the Yangtze River are wreaking havoc with like natural flows. But there is a lot more happening, and I think it's harder to kind of shine a light on it. I really want to get back to China and see some of these. What about? Do you have any anything to say about this realm?
No, but I have a question for Kyle.
Please do.
Yeah, let me. So you talked about smaller national parks. I'm curious what the next steps are, expanding beyond the initial 10, and like how they're thinking through how to build out the system.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're gonna go back again. Well, this blue sheep slide really takes forever. Okay. So this is the next. So they've announced that they want 49 total national parks. The system will be complete by 2035. They want about 2 ish ocean parks. That's interesting. We often forget to talk about water. Most of this presentation has been terrestrial land. So 2 marine parks, 1 kind of estuary park as well. And this is okay. This slide is purely gossip. Don't quote me. It's from WeChat, not from an official account, but from what I've seen, this really matches up. From a lot of the names here match up with the names of what I see in the news about new suggested national parks. So I think it's a pretty good list, just from my anecdotal and my research experience. We'll see what actually comes out. But I'm sorry I didn't translate it in English. But so these are some of the parks. And I think it's, you have a lot in the west, but you're going to have some in, Liupanshan and, Danxiashan. I mean, I don't have this on a map, but the new national parks are going to be kind of pinboarded all over. But I will say this, I don't think you should expect to see an increase of protected land via the national parks. And that's probably the most interesting aspect I'd like to point out, is that a lot of the time these national parks are really addressing the systematic issues that plagued the nature reserves, where you have nature reserves in China, but you also have national landscape areas and national wetlands. And a lot of times these jurisdictions were under different departments, whether it's the Water Resources Department, et cetera. And so now these, for example, the Giant Panda National Park, I think it takes together around 70 different nature reserves. It doesn't add much land to panda habitat, but it basically streamlines what was a very, very disjointed management system where you have one species sharing the territory, but different government departments managing that territory. And the National Parks Department brings it under the National Park Administration, which was created in 2018, and really streamlines that whole management structure. So that's probably the biggest thing to note about these parks. I haven't seen any data as far as how much lands it adds. It doesn't really add that much land. It just really redefines the funding source and the administration of these places.
And maybe better monitoring. Do we have some other questions out here? This side of the room is, okay, we'll take 2 on this side. We'll take 3 on this side. 1, 2, 3. Steve, Jurivan, and
Steve Jackson. I'm also a fellow at the China Environment Forum here at Wilson Center. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the marine parks. Are those the same as the marine protected areas that China's been setting up? And if they aren't, then who administers which?
Okay, and then let's go, Jurivan.
Hi. Hi. So I'm a research intern with Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Yuan. So this is a question for Lili, and I would like to ask, do you think, according to your observation in Beijing and other Chinese cities, the U.S. tariff on Chinese EV exports to America have any impact on Chinese consumer choices on, say, domestic or foreign-produced vehicles? For example, do Chinese people see the U.S. tariff as a sign of, buying more domestically produced EVs, or do you think they're still, open for other choices?
Tesla or something, yeah. And
Tesla.
last question there. These are nice, succinct questions. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Matthew. I'm a research intern at the East-West Center. And earlier this fall, there's a report by the Rhodium Group that showed that Chinese FDI in the United States had dramatically decreased. And there's even been pushback from local communities by Chinese vehicle battery parts makers, such as Goshen and Michigan. So my question is there a path for the investment environment to ease for Chinese automakers and EV vehicle battery parts makers in the United States? Will it become more difficult? What political change might have to take place to, spur more investment? Thank you.
All right, Lili gets to give a second talk. Do you want a marine one? Is the easy one to jump into?
Yeah, I think most of the marine protected, we're going to dive into this one, thank you. Marine protected areas fall on the lines of the ecological red lines. I think that's what, and I don't have the data on how much, actually, I think it's 150,000 square kilometers. Could be wrong, but that's what comes to mind. That's the number. I think it was, but it's a pretty easy stat, or you can give me your email. I can send you the data pretty quickly. And then the 2 marine parks are going to be within the red lines, but these are going to be places that are probably going to be more focused on the highest biodiversity value and also maybe cultural value, and then places that can have some ecotourism. So the red lines will basically prevent kind of exploitation of resources. I don't have the picture, but it's really interesting. If you've been to Hong Kong and Shenzhen, especially go to the Hong Kong side of Shenzhen Bay, you look across and there's all these oyster platforms, almost as far as the eye can see, because you can see Shenzhen, and there's none on the Shenzhen side of the bay. And the border between China and Hong Kong is literally the bay where these oyster platforms end, and then the open bay begins. And that's because there's a red line from Shenzhen which says you can't extract the oysters and use this part for aquaculture, and the Hong Kong part you can. So it's just a very visual demonstration. But I don't have a lot of the numbers on those. But I don't think we know which marine parks are going to be official national parks. But it's definitely a space to watch. And again, keep in touch, and I can definitely send you what I have.
I definitely have another nature reserve meeting. It was my last public meeting before COVID hit, so that's why today is kind of like we're reaching back. Lili, so you have two questions, one about Chinese car purchases and Matthew's exhaustive one.
Great questions. Yes, so on the Chinese consumer choice side, I think if I'm not incorrect that Tesla was actually the top selling EV in China last year, or among the top. So, previously China also had restrictions on foreign automakers entering the Chinese market. Typically, foreign automakers had to form a joint venture with a Chinese company to produce in China. Tesla was the first time that the Chinese government let a foreign company just set up shop. And there are some interesting pieces that have been written about why that was. And one New York Times piece talked about Tesla as a catfish to actually increase competition among the Chinese automakers by allowing such a high-performing EV company to enter the market. The theory was to stimulate competition, which we've really seen. There's been a price war going on in China, and push XPeng, NIO, the other leading companies to create better vehicles to match Tesla. So I think that's a really interesting story. It seems like China has other ideas for how useful these foreign companies can be in certain contexts, but I am curious going forward with the kind of exclusion of Chinese companies in the U.S., whether China will at some point put more barriers in place as well. China has responded to some of the kind of competitive measures the U.S. has put in place. For instance, a couple months ago, after the U.S., or this is just last month actually, the U.S. increased its export controls on chip technology, and China chose in this case to respond by actually putting export controls on graphite, which is a key battery mineral, which China controls the production of to a large extent, and the U.S. is very import reliant. So China's clear about where it holds the keys in terms of the supply chain, and I think across the board in terms of the battery minerals, China really is in a good position and may continue to weaponize the supply chain in response to U.S. measures. So there is definitely a lot of competition in the space, but in terms of your particular question right now, Tesla is a big has a big presence in China through the Shanghai factory, and they're supposed to be building another one as well.
So I'm going to ask Lili a question, and then you can ask Lili a question. Oh, yes, no. Oh, you got more? Sorry.
Yeah.
Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, I will try to be quick. That's a great question about FDI. I think from what we've seen, I don't see a reversal happening anytime soon. It seems like the political environment with the election cycle coming up especially will continue to be kind of closing down in terms of openness to China and Chinese investment. We just saw, I think it was a week or two ago, that Ford, which is supposed to be licensing technology from CATL, the biggest battery maker in the world, which is a Chinese company, for a plant in Michigan. They have now put that plant on pause, and the reason for that I've heard is because the Treasury Department is finalizing these rules for how the tax credits will be implemented under the IRA. And the key part that they're discussing still is this foreign entities of concern provision, which says that any car that uses any battery component from a foreign entity of concern, which includes China and Russia, will not be eligible for the tax credits. So the company Ford and other companies are not sure exactly how they will administer that, and if they're very strict about it, that batteries from that factory potentially might not be eligible for the tax credits. So I think while there's still uncertainty around that rule, we'll see hesitancy from the companies, and just generally speaking going forward, it's hard for me to see an influx of Chinese investment in the U.S. being very welcome. However, I do know that there are other companies that have been, like Polestar, have maybe Japanese names or foreign names that are joint ventures that can kind of slide under the radar. So I think in those cases, they may not attract as much attention and be able to be part of kind of this big clean energy investment push.
Okay, sorry, missed it before. How about the question of methane? And, in the Glasgow Climate Declaration from 2 years ago, I mean, it's basically methane, 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 methane. So everything from the coal and we assume they were also thinking about agriculture. What's your sense on, is this, because China just issued their methane action plan this week. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what this could mean? Are we coming together? Come on, Lili, are we coming back together?
I'll have to turn the mic back to you since you've been focusing on this. But I think, this plan, as Jennifer said, in the Glasgow Agreement, the U.S. committed to reducing, methane at that COP by 30% by 2030, along with other countries. China did not sign on to that international agreement, but did say it would release its own methane plan. I've had on my story list for years, write about the methane plan for years. We were just waiting and waiting for this to be released. It was released just 2 days ago now. And that's great that the plan is out. And I think it's being seen as a sign of kind of cooperation with the U.S. because it comes on the heels of this meeting between Xie Jianhua and Kerry. I haven't read the plan line by line, but from what I've seen, it's very high level, does not commit to any specific targets, which is a problem. And there's a general push to increase monitoring and verification of methane, which is a good trend for sure. But I think experts were hoping to see more specifics that would allow us to hold China accountable to some clear targets on methane. There was one concrete target I saw that is aiming to increase utilization of coal mine methane by 2025. And there's a specific numerical target attached to that, and that's super important because that's the biggest source of methane in China, and there are actually ways to capture that methane, even though it's definitely not an easy or straightforward thing to do. But I would love to hear your thoughts on what's happening with methane because you know so much.
Well, I mean, again, there weren't that many details, but I think that it kind of bespeaks how, the U.S. and China. I think the Chinese want to work together with the U.S. in setting standards. I think that, I don't know. I think that I was surprised it didn't have anything else in it as well, because they are definitely doing research on this, and we know that in the ag sector, there's some interest in this, but most of the focus for methane reduction, the policymakers are prioritizing the energy sector. Do you have any questions for Lili?
I do, yeah.
And then another one from out in the audience here. Who's going to want?
So Lili, when I was filming the documentary, actually, I went to Detroit and it was at GM. And I think at the time, they had a collaboration with, I think it was Wuling, and they had the Hongguang Mini, and that was one of the highest selling cars at the time, at least in China, and it was this really cheaply priced, I think it was only 40,000 RMB, or really low priced. And I haven't been really watching that space ever since, but in China, we have a lot of the higher model, whether it's Tesla or NIO, and what's the competition like or the sales like between these really accessible kind of maybe lower range cars versus these more high-end cars? When we see the growth of EVs, do you know what accounts for what, the kind of luxury brand versus kind of the everyday smaller cars?
Yeah, the smaller cars are dominating. It's cool. Those little cars, unlike the U.S., are still very popular. I think as of the last year's data I saw, I think are still the top selling models. I think as these fancier cars start to drop their prices, we might see a shift there. But for now, it's, those small cars are very, very popular. And I think kind of a cool trend to see where in the US, we're starting from a very different place where a lot of the first EVs are very large, trucks and, just very heavy cars. We need huge batteries for them. So it's nice in China where there's density in the cities where we can have these smaller EVs and also e-bikes, which we're slowly starting to use more in the U.S. as well.
For the IRA and the tariffs, is that's also probably keeping e-bikes out as well?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because I'm seeing a lot more e-bikes. Does anyone know? Is your e-bike made in China that you know?
I don't know.
No one knows.
I don't know if there's a provision for e-bikes.
Because I know that there was some in there to encourage U.S. e-bikes, but I don't know. I keep wondering, when I was first in China, do you guys ever hear of flying pigeon bicycles? Yeah. Who had a flying pigeon? Raise your hand.
We all started on a
Flying pigeon.
How can I get this in my luggage?
Forever, yeah. So flying pigeon bicycles, for those of you who are not in tune, they were always black, heavy as sin, but that with the road quality back in the 1980s, you needed it to be heavy. But yeah, there's kind of a sentimental spot. I'm wondering if flying pigeon flew into EV land. Put your microphone if you're talking.
In Xi'an, there is a museum of old bikes on the city walls. Yes, including the flying pigeon and the Yongjiu, which was mine. They were substantial.
I mean, when I lived in Changsha, I did the crazy thing that my foreign affairs office didn't find out till I came back. I actually bicycled from Changsha to Mao's birthplace, which took about 7 hours. An e-bike would have made it a lot easier, and bike trails. But yeah, so I have a soft spot for those kind of bikes. Dunning, do you have any questions for? You were in the film. You should ask a question. Oh, you have to microphone if you're going to use it.
I don't know. So Kyle's talk about a national park system actually feels China is going roads that U.S. has already traveled with national parks. That idea of a humanless wilderness, which I'm a little concerned about. But yeah, that's an inspiration, and so far I haven't got a really burning question.
Okay, just want to check.
I can. That's kind of a question. Well, it's kind of
a question.
It's an interesting topic. I will say that they are taking a bit of a different approach. Although there is 650,000 people living within the first 10 pilot parks, they have made, I think, a really commendable effort to as large of extent as possible to hire local people, allowing them to continue to live in the parks, and then hiring them or giving them work as rangers or educators. This is especially prevalent within the Giant Panda National Park and the Sanjiangyuan, the source of the three rivers. In Sanjiangyuan, there was a policy where they basically offered one member of every household a job to work as a ranger for the park to make 1,800 renminbi per month. So in Hainan, though, for example, they did move almost everyone out. So I think you're going to have a lot of variations, but I would say they've learned from the U.S.'s mistake as far as kicking everybody out. And I think they have done a pretty good job, at least as far as empowering and employing a lot of the local people.
Okay, I just realized, looked at the times, all of our waxing poetic about flying pigeon bikes. We've hit our time. So could we all applaud one more time for our great speakers today? And the China Environment Forum, Jennifer and I are going to be heading off to Southeast Asia, so we won't be having any meetings in December, but we've got some things teed up for food waste in U.S. and China coming up in January, probably some sand mining in China, Southeast Asia. Maybe talk about U.S., but yeah. But I want to thank you all for coming here, and the people online, you're cool too, but I couldn't serve you tea. So take care, everyone, and turn off your mics before you go, and we're good. Bye-bye.